Hello students, today we will continue our presentations on styles and movements, and today we will look at part 2 of this series. We have already seen movements like the Art Deco etc., and today we will start with Brutalism. Now, one of the objectives or purpose that is in the back of my mind when I teach this course is that I may introduce you to a large number of architects and their works in the modern times. In fact, starting from somewhere in the 18th century all the way into the 21st century, to familiarize you with many works of architects so that you get a very good idea of number of architects in their buildings. And second, of course, is to be able to see how the buildings have evolved with time, various building typologies, how they have changed with time, housing for example, or houses for example, how they have changed, or public buildings, how they have changed, how ideas and concepts of the past are impacting the buildings of today. That is why many times I show you pictures or images of the newest buildings in the 21st century in order to correlate that with what I have taught you, what I am teaching you with regard to past styles and movements and past concepts. So today we will start with Brutalism. We will look at Brutalism, we will look at Stijl briefly, then we will look at Constructivism, we will also look at Metabolism, and we will look at Futurist architecture. In Brutalism, I have already touched upon it when I was talking to you about Corbusier's work. He used it extensively in France and he used it in the design of Chandigarh, the capital complex in India. So here for example you see the Secretariat building, Unity Habitation, the Ronsham Chapel, where he used brutalist, where the works were brutalist, and the word brutalism was coined by British architects Allison and Peter Smithson, and it came from the term béton brut in French, which means raw concrete, and Corbusier used it as poured board mark concrete in Unity Habitation, and then it carried on into many other projects. In raw concrete works of Corbusier, like I said, these buildings are famous, and the first Brutalism is one of the first visible results of departure from the parent modernist movement. It flourished from 1950s to the mid 1970s. In fact, India had also a large number of brutalist buildings because of Corbusier coming to India. Other architects also carried forward brutalist architecture in their works, and in fact brutalism has not totally disappeared. Even in the 21st century we find examples of architects making brutalist buildings. For example, in India we have Matharu Associates, who are known for brutalist work. So the core traits of brutalism are exposed raw concrete surfaces and usually a monumental scale. For example, whether we see the Boston City Hall in Massachusetts, the Yale University by Paul Rudolph, the Art and Architecture building, or the Vilasa, this tower in Milan in 1954. It was popular in Britain, Germany, Canada, Brazil, US, India also, and the examples show buildings that are typically massive, monumental, fortress-like, with a dominance of exposed concrete or raw concrete construction. It became popular for educational institutions, especially for university buildings, but it was relatively rare for corporate projects. It was favored also by many government projects, high-rise housing and shopping centers. So if you talk about institutional academic buildings, this is the Institute of Hygiene and Microbiology in Berlin, and this is the Giselle Library on the UC San Diego campus. The best known brutalist architecture of course is the work of Le Corbusier with Unity Habitation and the Secretariat building as seen here. It gained momentum in the UK in the mid 20th century after World War II because the entire cities had been ravaged and communities needed inexpensive and fast construction, which was possible with raw concrete work. So low cost housing, shopping centers and government buildings came up with brutalist raw concrete work. Many architects even chose brutalist style in spite of large budgets because they were able to appreciate the honesty and the sculptural quality of using raw concrete. Now, for example, the Trellick Tower in London by Erno Goldfinger, it's got a very rough and blocky appearance, and it's the expression of structural materials and forms right on the outside, a raw concrete finish, a massive housing project in which services are on the exterior. This giant vertical slab that you see here, and this is the access tower, the freestanding access tower, and it is linked by walkways to the main tower block, the main slab tower. So this is how uniquely brutalist buildings had come up at the time. Moving on to the de-style movement, only very briefly to mention it, we will come back again to this house because this is very important for us. We will talk about this house, the Schrader house by Gerrit Rietveld, later on also when we discuss about composition, recomposition and decomposition, or rather decomposition and recomposition. When we talk about the houses themselves, this plays a very important role. In fact, we have already looked at it in some form earlier. This is a part of the de-style movement, the Dutch art movement that emerged in the early 20th century with pure abstraction, primary colors, geometric forms and asymmetrical compositions is what we see in these de-style movement buildings. Coming to constructivism, interestingly, not much is talked about constructivism. It came up in Soviet Union and Soviet Russia before, when it was still the Soviet Union, and emerged after the revolution of 1917, the Russian Revolution of 1917, and it showed both engineering logic and abstract art. It was not just the style, it was in fact an ideological movement for building a socialist society, which is what Soviet Union was then heading after 1917. It was focused on function, industrial materials and bold forms, and inspired by machinery, efficiency and Soviet ideals. Constructivism, in terms of chronology, came up a little before, you can say, the international style and modernism, and it had a very strong influence on the works of the architects of international style modernism. And it had a very strong graphic and structural aesthetic even in the unbuilt works, which were many. And if you take an example, the Pravda building, Pravda used to be a newspaper at that time in the Soviet Union, and it was designed by A. Vesnin. This is asymmetry and geometrical volumes, exposed structural system. The functions have been zoned and visibly expressed in the form. There are use of ramps, bridges and glass curtain walls, and integration of graphics and typography. But unfortunately, this building was never built, it only existed on paper. A few buildings that were actually realized, these works had constructivist ideals of utility, efficiency and a bold visual expression. For example, the Pravda building that was built, this is the Pravda building Moscow by Golozov in 1935, which had offices and printing press and a very clear industrial logic. In fact, the entire build form is the earlier than the Bauhaus, or I would say Bauhaus had already taken place. It happened parallelly to the Bauhaus, but the Unity habitation still had to come up. So overall, these kind of works had a strong impact on international style architects. And then there is the Rusakov Club, which is a fan-like theatre block and a functionally driven form. So functional form derived through function was there in constructivism also. Then we have the Zvev Club here, which has this glass stair cylinder, and it is dramatic, this building, yet it is functional, utilitarian building. So these projects came up around the same time the international style modernism were also picking up in the other part of Europe, and they influenced those works also. But unfortunately, many of the projects in constructivism remained unbuilt because of the economic and political shifts that were happening in the Soviet Union at the time. Chernikov, his drawings that you see here, very famous, they trained architects in dynamic composition, but they were never built. Then there is the Narkomfin housing by Ginsberg, which was a forerunner to Le Corbusier's United Habitation. So you can see how influential this movement was. Much of constructivism lived on paper, yet it influenced a generation of modernist architects, and the emphasis was on structure and clarity. It left behind a lasting legacy. Then we come to metabolism. Metabolism was a post-war Japanese design movement that came up in the 1960s, and it happened because of the massive destruction that had taken place in Japan. There was an urgency to rebuild. After the atomic bombings of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and large scale urban destruction because of firebombing also in other cities, Japan had an urgent need of reconstruction, and traditional architecture was largely destroyed, and there was left a blank slate to begin experimenting. They envisioned cities of the future with buildings that were like living and evolving organisms, large scale, flexible, prefabricated and expandable structures which have the ability to adapt, to grow over time like organic growth. And the traditional laws of fixed form and function, or the idea of form follows function, that whole idea according to them become obsolete. There was unprecedented economic growth and urban expansion in 1960s Japan, and there was pressure on architects to find solutions to the problem of overpopulation, and thus the desire to create megastructures and utopian solutions that could accommodate the housing needs of the rising population. In early 1960, young Japanese architects thought of a new structural system, in which the parts of the building could be added, could be removed as per the changing needs of the people. This new movement, the entire new concept that the architects were thinking, came to be called as metabolism. And the principles are that there to be megastructures which are modular and capable of expansion and have a framework into which smaller elements can be plugged or replaced. They were also particularly inspired by the University of East Anglia's ziggurats, which was the student housing there, and it was based on repeated modular student units. They were also strongly influenced by Moshe Sabdi's habitat in the Montreal Exposition in 1967, and it was a stunning prefabricated complex that Moshe Sabdi had envisioned and that was built there. The idea that they saw were a random arrangement of cellular residential units as you see here in the picture, and it allows for maximum natural light to enter the dwellings and to give, and each dwelling, each house has, or each housing unit has very good views. It offers the possibility of buildings extension in any direction according to the needs of the prospective residents. Now, but the reality was that many projects failed to get off the ground, but examples of metabolist form include the New Sky building that you see here in Shinjuku, and the most famous metabolist building of all is the Nakajin Capsule Tower by Kisho Kurokawa in 1970. First, the discussion on metabolism came on the world stage for the first time in the Tokyo World Conference of Design in 1960. Iconic Japanese architects like Kenzo Tange, Kisho Kurokawa, Fumihiko Maki announced their concept of new architectural approach and a proposal for a new urbanism. Majority of the metabolist works was residential and directed towards trying to solve the housing problem. Now, metabolism, as you know, is a human biological process, and their concept of metabolism bears a very strong metaphorical relationship with the metabolism in the human body. Due to human metabolism, which is the sum of physical and chemical changes taking place in our body, it helps in cell growth. Cell growth helps the human body to function normally, to grow healthy and to sustain itself. So metaphorically, the metabolists believe that contemporary architecture should be changeable to meet the rapidly changing requirements. As in the human body, buildings to be mechanized in a biological way so that they can sustain in the present they can continue in the present and be adapted to rapidly growing technology in the future. So, buildings will adapt with the changing times and changing technology. Number of features that characterize the metabolist movement. There was large scale structures which are capable of growing organically in the vertical and horizontal direction. When I am making this point, please understand this is only the theory behind it. Did it actually happen? Could buildings actually grow vertically or horizontally? Practically, I do not think it ever really happened. The design of buildings were not to follow the modernist views of form follows function, but allows spaces and forms to be adapted in into changeable function in the future, and adaptable plug-in megastructures which express progress in building technology. So, we have the Nakajin Capsule Tower by Kishore Kurokawa, where the capsules can be added or removed based on the changing needs. And coming to the Nakajin Capsule Tower, it is the most expressive of metabolic structures that came up, having 13 floors, 140 individual flats. Each flat was a pre-formed capsule that was manufactured, shipped on site and then assembled. The main concept allowed the capsule units to be plugged into or removed from the main structure, so the form of the building was changeable. This was the concept. It practically did not happen. Capsules were prefabricated and equipped with necessary services including furniture, so they came completely ready and then they were plugged into the building. The capsules were adjusted around the main core to create an irregular form which would evolve according to the needs of the people. So, the Nagachin Capsule Tower, we see these are this is an individual capsule, this is the interior of it, and this is how they are all plugged into the building irregularly. And interestingly, if you look at this form, it will also remind you of Moshe Sabdi's habitat. This slide actually shows you how the plugging in takes place, that it is brought in via crane, plugged into the building, it is in a completely fully ready form, and this is the overall plan of the plugged in capsules in the Nakajin Capsule Tower. These are some other views of it, how they have been irregularly plugged in, and this is the interior of the capsule tower. Another important project in the metabolist movement was the Yamanashi Press and Radio Center in Kofu by Kenzo Tange. This also had the concept of plug-in addition and removal, and it was a significant example of the metabolist movement. Instead of capsules, what it had was horizontal slabs. There was a solid service towers which had elevators and staircases that you see here, and around which horizontal slabs were adjusted, clipped on or removed to satisfy changing conditions. The building was an expression of high technology in the building industry. This is again the pictures of the Yamanashi Press and Radio Center by Kenzo Tange. You can see these slabs that have been added in between the service towers. They could be adjusted, they could be clipped on, and then they could be removed. That was the concept behind it. Clusters in the Air in Tokyo, another imaginative project which was never built, but it was a project designed by Arata Izuzaki. The main concept is a new way of structuring housing projects around Tokyo through these clusters, in which the clusters were metaphorically leaves of trees. These are the housing units that you see here, these are the housing units, leaves of trees, and the core in between through which these apartments are hanging. This core is metaphorically the trunk of the tree. The project could grow and extend organically according to changing needs and according to the requirements of the modern age. That was the concept behind it. So many of these ideas of changing buildings that could be adapted with time, with changing technology, that could have organic growth, and the idea of using capsules like used in the Nakajin Capsule Tower were later on used in the high-tech architecture movement by architects like Norman Foster, in which the toilet units of the HSBC in Hong Kong were manufactured in Tokyo, shipped on site to Hong Kong and then plugged into the building. Just as the capsule of the Nagarjuna capsule tower were completely fully finished and then brought and installed on site, there also the toilets were fully finished and then installed on site. Similar ideas were also explored in the Lloyd's Bank in London, in the Lloyd's of London, and some ideas in Centre Pompidou in Paris. When we discuss high-tech architecture, we will again come back to this point, that how this ideology or concept of metabolism was reflected in the high-tech architecture movement also. Now coming to futurist architecture. In general, if we talk about the movement, we can also call it futurism, but that would be entailing many other aspects besides architecture. So, we will call it futurist architecture. In the early 20th century, it was born in Italy with the idea of long dynamic lines suggesting speed, motion and urgency. You must understand why these movements were coming up. Around this time, automobiles, airplanes, etc. had come in the human society, and when they saw these machines moving fast on these roads or flying in the air, this brought to them the idea that times had changed. Now the machines had come with speed and motion, and they were strongly impacted by it. So, futurist architecture is actually a part of futurism, which was an artistic movement, and this futurist architecture was a cult of the machine age. That means it was obsessive admiration of technology, of speed, of mechanization and industrial progress in the 20th century. They were very strongly influenced up to the point of obsession towards these technologies. That is why it was a very strongly radical ideological movement. Though connected with modernism, it was the radical version of modernism. Included particularly the architect Antonio Sant'Elia, who thought, though had built little, but he translated the futurist vision into an urban form. So, if you look at chronologically how these movements happen in the timeline, we can say early modernism stretches from 1890s to 1910. So, we are looking at the works of the Chicago School, the coming up the skyscraper in America, and across the Atlantic in Europe we are looking at the works of Art Nouveau, particularly the later works of Art Nouveau which were mechanomorphic. Please refer back to my lectures on Art Nouveau. We talked about the works of C.R. Mackintosh, Otto Wagner, Joseph Hoffmann, and all of them started bringing forward buildings that were more towards modernism than towards the natural ornamental features that had been borrowed from nature in Art Nouveau. They had moved away from that, and gradually the buildings were looking more and more like the buildings of we see later in the 20th century. There was a simplicity, there was a focus on function and a rejection of ornament in these buildings. Futurism came around 1909, and it was obsessive thinking about speed, machines, future obsessed. Violence is also a word used to describe it. Then high modernism, or rather we can say just modernism as we know it, from the 1920s to the 1940s with the works of Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and the whole group of architects which were a part of CIAM, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, and all of them international style architects. There was Bauhaus, there was steel and glass architecture, there were the 5 points of a new architecture by Corbusier, all this dominated. So, futurism or futurist architecture was a part of early modernism if you look at this bracket, but it was more radical and ideological, especially in Italy. It was influenced by modernist architecture like Sant'Elia's machine inspired cities, but it did not shape mainstream modernism. Mainstream modernism continued to become more functional and universal like Bauhaus and like the contribution of the entire Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne. The manifesto of futurist architecture is very interesting. I would like to read out to you directly from that, and then I will relate to you with the buildings of the modern times which are connected with futurism and what has come to be known as Neo-Futurism. We no longer believe in the monumental, the heavy, the static. We have enriched our sensibilities with a taste for lightness, for transience and practicality. Then Elia says, we must invent and rebuild our modern city like an immense shipyard, active, mobile and dynamic, and the modern building like a giant machine. Lifts must no longer hide away like solitary worms in stairwells, but must swarm up the facades like serpents of glass and iron. So this we see here in the Lloyds of London, as he said in the manifesto, the modern building is like a gigantic machine, and that is true for the Lloyds of London. That lifts will swarm up the facades like serpents of glass and iron again became true in the Lloyds of London and many buildings across the world in the modern times. Then we have the Città Nuova, which was designed by Antonio Sant'Elia, conceptualized by him, amongst the earliest depictions of an architecture that glorifies technology of concrete, steel and glass and gives dramatic expression to lift towers, girder bridges, elevated walkways, all seen in these pictorial representations drawn by Antonio Sant'Elia. Then the apartment building Casa e Gradinate designed by Sant'Elia, massive industrial aesthetic, like it was made for speed and motion, and it had these terraced step down apartments which allowed for a vertical city growth. There was no classical ornamentation. It was influenced by futurist themes of movement, power, technology and looking towards the future. This is a computer visualization of what Sant'Elia's buildings would actually look if they were to be actually built. Then the electric power station designed by him, it was on gigantic scale because they wanted to glorify and accentuate these technologies that were there all around them. The technology of engines and machines and power stations. So it has towers and smokestacks and gears that dominate the design. It has a machine aesthetic, a layered infrastructure with visible circulation pipes, transport systems and no ornament. The function is the form of the building. It celebrates electricity as the new power of the machine age, of the modern age. And thus it was a pointer to the industrial future, like the actual construction of the Greenwich Power Station built between 1902 to 1910, which used to power the tramway system of London. Nowadays it is a backup for the London Underground. Again coming back to the manifesto of futurist architecture, he said futurist architecture, healthy growth of the futurist house, of constructing it with resources of technology and science, trampling down all that is grotesque and antithetical like tradition, style, aesthetics and proportion of the past, determining new forms, new volumes, an architecture whose existence is solely the unique condition of the modern life, an architecture that cannot be subjected to any law of historical continuity. It must be new. Futurist architecture is the architecture of calculation and simplicity, of reinforced concrete, steel and glass, textile fiber and all those substitutes that enable us to obtain maximum elasticity and lightness in our structures. Oblique and elliptical lines are dynamic. They possess power 1,000 times stronger than the perpendiculars and the horizontals. No integral dynamic architecture can exist that does not include these. Decoration superimposed on architecture is absurd. Decorative value of futurist architecture depends solely on the use and original arrangement of raw colored materials. The fundamental characteristic of futurist architecture will be its impermanence and transience. The constant renewal of the architectonic environment will contribute to the victory of futurism. How apt these words sound today, because we have buildings around us that have been built on these principles, where the decorative value is not coming from superimposed decoration but from raw primary colors used in the building. Where there is impermanence and transience coming in our buildings and in the buildings that are to come in the 21st century, there is a constant renewal happening of the architectonic environment around us. There are oblique and elliptic lines that are dynamic in our buildings, whether it is the City Hall in London by Norman Foster, the Curve in Amsterdam by Oz Architects, or Burj Al Arab by Tom Wright in the UAE. This shows you a glimpse of what we can expect in the future. So like he said in his manifesto, we must exploit our roofs and put our basements to work, depreciate the importance of facades, and we have done it in the modern times. We have started using our roofs as green roofs. We have started using, United Habitation used the roof as workable roof garden with crash and a jogging track, etc. We have underground tube stations all over the world in which underground metros run under the city. This is the underground that is there all over the world, including India. Let us sync the streets and the squares. So we have pathways which run underneath our streets, and there are these walkways that are created in our cities. Street will plunge many stories down into the earth, and that has happened, embracing the metropolitan traffic, linked up for necessary interconnections by metal gangways and swift moving pavements. How could he think of it at the time? We have swift moving pavements in our airports called travelators. We've got escalators, we've got pathways underground, we've got escalators. All this that he conceptualized in the manifesto, what architecture would be, has actually happened. Thus we have the term Neo-Futurism. When he said oblique and elliptic lines are dynamic and possess power, Neo-Futurism is a modern evolution of futurism or futurist architecture, where many ideas of Antonio Sant'Elia's manifesto find renewed expression in these works today. They are oblique elliptic lines which are dynamic, like in the Heather Aliyev Center or this work by Santiago Calatrava, the Mercedes Museum and the other building, and many more buildings around us which have got sculptural expression, for example in the works of Santiago Calatrava, which are based on parametric architecture like the works of Zaha Hadid. So what he said in the manifesto has come true. Now concluding with this slide, the past our buildings used to be solid and monumental, meant to last forever, like the pyramids. Then the present came, building with slender members, transparency, light, open structures, and buildings to last a finite period of time, like for example the HSBC Hong Kong. They would be demolished and rebuilt, a new building for a new generation. The future, the buildings will be adaptable. They have capacity to change with use and evolve with time. It somehow reads as if something from the metabolist agenda also. It built to have indefinite lifespans or several small lifespans within this undefined period, like a building that is thought of called the hollow skins, moving towards an adaptable, evolvable and ecological built environment. So we will conclude here and we will begin with late modernism in our next presentation. Thank you.